various points, I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask if you got any questions, comments, or concerns about anything that I've got to say. What are we dealing with in this COVID-19 world? One is what can be like threats. Just showing up to work is a risk issue, and you're putting your health and you're putting your family's life in danger. Another issue that is coming up in this COVID environment is we have a culture conflict between those who are able to work from home, and often those people are highly paid knowledge workers, versus those people who are required to show up at work and deal with customers. And those people often are less well paid. That's particularly true in the hospitality and the healthcare sector. We've got this culture conflict. Another culture conflict that we're going to be seeing over the next 10 years is because of COVID and the downturn in the economy, some of the weaker companies will be absorbed by some of the stronger companies. There will be industry consolidation, industry roll-ups. People will find themselves now working for larger companies that they didn't want to work for. And on the other hand, they're afraid to leave their job and go into the job market because the job market sucks. So they're going to be feeling sort of trapped where they are. And the last issue that we're going to be seeing over the next 2 years is high stress at work. After companies downsize, right size, restructure, whatever you want to call it, you're going to have a smaller group of employees dealing with work, and they're going to feel stressed, overstressed, and under-resourced. That's the environment that I see over the next 2 years. Does anybody see anything differently, or don't think this is wrong? So, assuming you agree with me, how do you manage in that kind of environment? My goals today are talking about a television show that some of you may have seen, some of you may not have seen, called Nash, and the key issues in that show, and then how those key issues relate to the key issues I just described in a COVID-19 world. And I wanted to show one scene about Colonel Potter, who's the head of that Nash unit. I'm not going to be able to do it on Zoom, but if any of you would like to copy the PowerPoint slides, it'll have the link to that scene. And then I'm going to show how Colonel Potter transforms an adversary into an adversary chum. And then we'll have a discussion. This is the cast of the television show Nash. It appeared on CBS from 1972 to 1983, an 11-year run. By the way, raise your hand if you've ever seen Nash, the television show. Okay, so it was a book, it was a movie starring Donald Sutherland, and then it became a television show for 11 years. That's an incredible long run for TV. The final episode was aired February 28, 1983. It had 50 million viewers. 50 million viewers. It's ranked as the highest rated television episode in history. Just to give you a kind of a sense, 50 million viewers for that show. And I think the last presidential debate last week, they got 10 million viewers. So this is about the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital in South Korea during the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. This is a battlefield surgical unit, and behind the actors you see a tent, and that's symbolic of the MASH unit because it would go to where the battle is. It would receive soldiers who've been injured, and they would be the initial medical contact with these injured soldiers. Many of them had shrapnel wounds, bullet wounds. They would take the shrapnel out, the bullets out. They would amputate legs, arms, stabilize the soldiers, put them on helicopters, and take them to a better equipped hospital. So that was what the MASH unit was about. Now, this picture captures the culture conflict of the show. This MASH unit is a group of knowledge workers. They're mostly surgeons, nurses, and administrators. It is a life-threatening situation. They are in a war zone. Some of them want to be there. They are called regular Army people, and they're making the Army their career. Some people are not there out of their own free choice. They're called draftees. They were required to serve time by the United States government, or they'd go to jail. Many of them didn't like the Army. And this picture shows the dynamic in the show. The man on the extreme left is Hawkeye Pierce, played by actor Alan Alda, and he refuses to salute when everybody else is salute. He is nothing but contempt for the Army and the Army's values and the Army's way of doing things. He doesn't believe in the war, and yet he's in it. And again, he promises to be the enemy of Colonel Sherman Potter, who is the head of the MASH unit. Colonel Potter is a regular Army person. He's approaching retirement age. This is the dilemma facing Colonel Potter. Hawkeye is the best surgeon in the MASH unit. How does he get Hawkeye's cooperation, despite knowing that Hawkeye despises everything that the colonel stands for? The beginning of Confucius once said, the beginning of wisdom is to call things by the right names. One of the things that I see in my consulting work, which is usually on leadership development, organization development, team development, is what I call the knowledge worker paradox. You have these incredibly smart employees who are very narrowly trained in very specific technical areas, and they can diagnose issues within their technical sphere of confidence. However, they don't have a common language to diagnose relationships at work. This would not be a problem if you have an individual contributor who's working by herself, but most of the work in your companies are now being done by teams. And so when you misdiagnose relationships at work, that can have very negative consequences. So I'm going to talk about the Peabody Diagnostic system for looking at relationships at work. We have two axes that we talk about. The first axis is called the unconditional axis. And on one end of that, you have friends, and on the other end of it, you have enemies. When I use the word friend, I am talking about a relationship with someone that is unconditional. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you say. That person is going to be your friend. You don't have to keep up with that person. I've got a friend from high school. We've stayed in touch very infrequently over the years, maybe once every 2 years. I might call him or he might call me. We send a Christmas cards. That's about it. On the other hand, I know if I was in trouble, I could call him and I know he would help me. And he knows the same would be true about me. How many of you have friends, using that as a criteria? Workplace relationships, work is not a good place for friendship, because friendship by definition is a contingency-based relationship. It's based on how the company's doing. It's based on your performance. You may have people that who report to you that you feel warmly to, but they can't be your friends. Harry Truman once said, if you want a friend in Washington, D.C., get a dog. It's not a good place for friendship. Now, enemies is the other end of the unconditional relationship. Doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter what you say. This person absolutely wants you out of the organization. They want you out of their lives. Now, in all my years, I would say I've had one enemy. This was a person I just thought they would not stop with anything unless I was out of the organization. And I never knew why. And I thought maybe I'm making this up. And then after I left the organization, I really found out, no, I was right. This person just had it in for me. That's the way it goes. How many of you have ever had an enemy like that? Doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter what you say, They want you gone. The next is a conditional relationship. And on one axis are adversaries and allies. And what I mean by that is Jackie and I can be allies on one particular issue because it benefits Jackie and me. On another issue, we can be adversaries because it benefits Jackie. Prior to Donald Trump, our relationship with China was adversary and ally. In some areas, like climate change, we actually worked together. Some areas we didn't. Now it's being moved towards a different kind of relationship. Another relationship is called chums. Chums are adversaries, allies with benefits. In other words, these are people you actually like to be with, but they're not your friends. I once wrote an article for MIT Sloan Management Review, and that there's a stereotype called "it's lonely at the top." Actually, it's not lonely at the top. It's filled with chums, and that can be very meaningful and very pleasant. Chums are people that you like to be with, but they're not your friends. One of the things that I find, because we do executive level outplacement, somebody, Shannon gets fired, and suddenly people that she thought she was friends with don't return her calls. And she gets very upset and depressed, and she gets very bitter. But the reality is, Shannon had misdiagnosed the relationship from the beginning. She never had any friends at work. She had chums at work. And the relationship was a contingency-based one. Once Shannon no longer could advance their cause, they had no reason to continue the relationship with Shannon. The problem wasn't them. The problem was Shannon's diagnosis of the relationship. Now, here is the master chum person. This is the man on the left is President Ronald Reagan, a Republican, a conservative. The man on the right is Tip O'Neill, a Democrat liberal from Massachusetts and Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Excuse me, Larry.
Yep.
Can you adjust your mic?
In what way?
You're getting a little, maybe take it away a little bit from your mouth because it's a little bit of feedback there with movement.
How about this?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Larry.
Sure. During the day, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan would oppose each other. Tip O'Neill was the voice of liberalism. Ronald Reagan was the conservative. In the evening, Tip O'Neill would come to the White House and dine at the private quarters with Nancy and Ronald. They enjoyed each other's company. They laughed together. They were never friends, but they were chums, despite being adversaries. Another good example of this was Tip O'Neill and the Senate Majority Leader. His name was, I'm blanking out on his name. He ran for president against Bill Clinton, a conservative from the Midwest. Anybody remember his name? He got a condominium in Florida, and Tip O'Neill bought a condominium in the same building as this guy so they could spend their vacations together, even though Tip O'Neill is the liberal Democrat and this guy was the head of the conservative Republicans. They still enjoyed each other's companies, even though they were adversaries. This is when things began to change in Washington, D.C. Newt Gingrich of Georgia was a Republican, conservative, and chair and Speaker of the House of Representatives. Bill Clinton was president. Newt Gingrich began to describe liberals as enemies. Now, once he started using that word enemies, things began to change. If you describe somebody that is opposed to you as an adversary and you compromise with an adversary, that's called being practical. If you describe someone as an enemy and you compromise with an enemy, that's described being a sellout. So Newt Gingrich began to use the word, and we're still suffering the consequences of that. And you see the consequences in Washington, D.C. to this day. Now, that begins Colonel Potter. How do you manage your enemies? The first thing Colonel Potter did was he said Hawkeye is not an enemy, he's an adversary. And his mission was to turn an adversary into a chum. But it's only a 2-minute scene. And let me describe what happens.
These OR sessions run pretty long, don't they, Pierce?
Uh-huh.
I was transferred here 7 days ago. Seems like I've been operating for 8.
And this has been an easy week. Oh, I've about had it.
Well, for a man who's had it, you sure do a bang-up job. You're from Maine, right, Pierce?
Right.
Do much fishing?
Yeah, but not for a long time.
I'm a fisherman. Now that I think of it, standing around hip deep in a freezing river till my legs got numb might have been the best training I could have had for standing at these OR tables. I guess, being from Maine, you went after deep sea stuff.
I got a bluefin once, but it took me over an hour to land them.
I wouldn't mind spending an hour like that.
Mostly my dad and I fish for salmon in the St. Croix River.
Not many of those sockeyes make it to Missouri. What's the biggest one you ever tied into?
30-pounder.
30?
Yeah, well, when I saw the line stripping, I thought it was just the current, you know. And then he jumped, and I couldn't believe my eyes. He was a horse. And then he took off. I couldn't reel him in because I was afraid he'd break this lousy 10-pound line I had, you know. So I had to go after him. I was jumping over logs and rocks and dodging branches, and all the while trying to keep the tension on the line. Now, well, the sound of a waterfall kept getting louder and louder. And sure enough, about 3 turned ankles later, there we were at the top of this falls, you know, and it was his big chance. But all the fight was out of him, and I just reeled him in. I reached into his mouth to pick him up, and just then he thrashed his head, and he drove the hook right into my thumb. And then he took off, you know, he was gone.
So you ended up with a fat thumb for a trophy.
Yeah, right.
You know, I didn't bring any gear, but I'll bet we could rig up something to snag whatever swims around in these parts.
Might be worth a try. These rivers are probably full of North Korean fish heading south.
Well, guess we better get back at it.
Right. You not only knew what to say, but what not to say. My dad's a lot like that. It makes me miss him a little less knowing that you're around. My father called me Hawkeye after the character in The Last of the Mohicans. It's his favorite book. I'd like you to have the copy he gave me.
Watch the racket, honey.
So I want to describe the art of chumship using that as a framework. The first thing you note is they met in a courtyard. Typically, a courtyard is not your office, not the other person's office, but not your home, but some sort of neutral place. Before COVID, neutral places might be a restaurant out for breakfast or lunch. A neutral place might be a golf course. A neutral place might be a wine tasting event. A neutral place might be a walk in the park. Not your office, not the other person's office, but the courtyard. Where are there courtyards? Again, this is a complex issue because of COVID. where a courtyard that you could go to would be some sort of park where you can walk in the woods. The next thing is Colonel Potter turns to Hawkeye and says, you're a damn good surgeon. Appreciation is contagious. We know that viruses are contagious, and we're dealing with one right now. But appreciation and emotions are also contagious as well. If you begin to talk about how much you appreciate the work your adversary is doing, that's a good way to get appreciation back. The third thing that Colonel Potter does is focus on something they have in common outside work. Now, that is fishing. When guys in Georgia get together, often the common thing they can focus on that they both enjoy outside work is something like golf, like football, and they can have discussions about their common interest in those areas. When women get together, it may not be those things. It might be something else, like maybe wine tasting. But what thing could you talk about with your adversary that would be a common ground? And then invite them for some sort of social activities that help bind them together. Again, pre-COVID, something like golf. Let's go to a football game together. Maybe let's go to a wine tasting program together. Or you like plays, I like plays. Why don't we go to the theater together? If there's a male-female thing, like eyebrows might be raised because you're female and you're asking me out, maybe we take our spouses with us so that there's no sexual issue here. But those are the four basic ideas around chumship. Find a courtyard. And again, in COVID world, some sort of walk in the woods is a good courtyard. Go biking together. I know here in Massachusetts, I probably go cross-country skiing with someone. So we can ski, we can talk to each other out in the woods, and we're not going to contaminate each other. Focus on some sort of common ground that the two of you have in common outside work, and then invite them for some activity to do that. So let me stop at this point. Any comments, questions, or concerns about anything that I've raised?
I've got a comment, Larry.
Sure.
This is Jackie Brader. So I love the language that you've provided, because as you said, that you need to kind of find a common language, and thinking about people at work and how to get them to a good place. Don't you feel like in today, or I guess I shouldn't phrase it that way, it feels like in today's society that everything you see on TV is still slanted so much towards the enemy, and that there's not this ability to find that common ground, and there's not this ability to be able to move forward. And so what's being role modeled for people is absolutely the part that you said is the sellout, right? We can't even have a conversation. We can't have differing views. So how do we get past that? Because that to me is just becoming a massive roadblock.
I have, Jackie, you're raising a really fundamental issue here. And I have to deal with it at two levels. First level is, as a society, that is a problem. And the media, social media, is only exacerbating that problem. And it clearly has become dysfunctional. Mm-hmm. And you see that in every day in Congress. This is not about Donald Trump. I deliberately talked about Newt Gingrich because mm-hmm. Donald Trump didn't invent all this stuff. Mm-hmm. He just capitalized on it. Mm-hmm. And it's been going on before him, and it's going to go on after him. So we have a big meta issue in terms in those terms. My second level is, how do you deal with it as a leader in your own company? Right. And I can't change some of norms that are going on, the big norms. What I can do is, one is have all your employees sort of learn a common language to look at relationships. Let me give you an example. Words have power. I was working, one of my clients was MIT, and I was in a department where this professor was in control of millions of dollars of grants. He was so important in his field, there was a laboratory named after him. And he had PhD students from all over the world who wanted to study under him. But he described the chairman of the department as his enemy. Well, once he uses the word enemy, that creates a certain expectation within the department, because you can side with the chairman or you can side with me, but you can't do both. And so these poor PhD students had to make political decisions about who am I going to align myself with. And the junior faculty had to make political decisions about who I align themselves with. I went to the chairman and I said, isn't there anything the two of you would have in common? And he says, yeah, I think we both agree we need more women in our discipline. I said, well, I was talking to this professor and he has this idea. And the chairman says, yeah, I think it's a good idea. I said, okay, I'm going to recommend my professor that he suggest this idea of his at the faculty meeting, and you will accept it, right? He says, yeah, I'll accept it. So I go to the professor and I said, my hypothesis is you have misdiagnosed your relationship with the chairman. If he indeed is your enemy and you propose this idea, the chairman is going to reject the idea because it came from you. A true enemy would do that. On the other hand, if the chairman accepts your idea and wants to work with you on that, he can't be your enemy. He has to be your adversary / ally. And that in this one area of getting more women in the field, you both are allied together. In other areas, you may be opposed to each other, but you're not enemies. You're adversaries. So he goes to the faculty meeting, raises his hands, makes the suggestion. The chairman says, I think that's a great idea. I'm willing to work with you on it, and immediately change the culture of the department just by changing the word. But the idea is everybody should be having the same language to describe relationships at work.
Can I offer some thoughts on this?
Sure, please.
I've had the great pleasure of working for many years at a company that I would say was the least dysfunctional company that I've ever been at. Grew from very small to very big. My department, specifically my division, I should say, I wasn't a department, my division, I would say was very collaborative. And obviously it took it a lot, it helped it to grow tremendously, and we got a lot done. I now work at a company, COO, smaller. One of the things that attracted me to the company that they implemented was personality testing, of course, but also they had an actual staff advocate. So the idea of kind of creating chums, to me, creating relationships, I don't see how to make them on a macro level. I don't see it working like we're all going to go to a team building event and then we're all going to be chums. So what we did is we just didn't even try. Don't get me wrong, we don't have those kinds of, it's not that we don't have those kinds of things, but we recognized from the outset that the nature of relationships was based on one-to-one. So the purpose of this staff advocate, so first of all, there was a culture from the very, very outset that said, if you are the type of person who, oh gosh, can't get behind other people, that can't support other people, that put yourself first, that maybe uses some of the language that you're talking about here, you're the wrong culture fit, period. So you have to weed those people out. And by the way, at my previous company I talked about, that was what we did so well within my division. Brilliance did not trump collaboration. But at any rate, at my current company, I'd like to say that it was my great idea to be able to, bring in the staff advocate whose role was really to be kind of everything you want HR to be, which is not somebody who tells on you to the boss, but rather somebody who truly helps you to understand your personality versus the personality of the person you're talking to, and how to communicate with them effectively, how to understand what they're trying to achieve versus you're trying to achieve. It wasn't, though. It was the CEOs. And it has been very, very effective. And what I would say, though, is it has to come from the executive leadership being 100,000% behind it. If one person doesn't buy into it, the COO wants to do it, the CEO is like, well, if you want to, it isn't going to work, because it's an active process of saying you're the wrong fit for this company because you cannot function within the parameters of trying to understand what you're not good at. Put first the fact that you are flawed in order to be able to receive other people and behave toward other people in a way that they most want to be treated. So anyway, when everybody's working on that level, then nobody's ever better than everybody else. You know what I mean? And you have this culture of people that are all really trying to figure out, because it's incumbent upon them to try to figure out how to basically, get to the art of being chums, And again, you may not really become chums, you may not love each other, but you find your common ground. So anyway, a few thoughts from me that may be relevant.
Oh, absolutely. It does have to come from the top. But the first step is to have a common language. So people understand the difference between friendship and chumship.
Fantastic. Well, we had a couple of questions come through on the chat, Larry.
Okay, sure.
Shannon's question is, what is the best way to find common ground with people in other states? And then we had a second to that statement is, and to add to Shannon's question, in a remote COVID world with video burnout. So, people are tired of being on Zoom, but we do have to work with global organizations, So how can we manifest this with these things in mind?
We have an article that I can, if anybody's interested, I can send. It's about a Swedish custom called fika, F-I-K-A. And fika is sometime in the afternoon, people just stop working and they meet each other and have a cup of coffee and pastry that they bring in. And the idea is to don't have coffee with someone that you know, have coffee with somebody that you don't know. So let me give you an example of fika. I was working as a psychologist in a community mental health center in a poor part of Dallas. And there were conflicts between healthcare systems within the community. Somebody would come into my clinic and say they were depressed and suicidal, and they would get medicine. Then they would go to the Planned Parenthood clinic and say they were depressed and suicidal, and then they would get medicine. Then they go to the hospital, say they're depressed and suicidal, they get the medicine. Then they get all this medicine, and then they go to the local middle school and they start selling it to children. And our problem was, how do we find these people who are doing this? Because we have these very strong confidentiality laws that prohibit us from disclosing who our clients are. So I arranged a brown bag lunch just for healthcare providers from the community. No managers allowed. And once a month we would meet, and there was absolutely zero agenda. And we would talk about kids, we would talk about cars, we would talk about wine. And eventually we got to trust each other. Know, like, trust, and then you start doing business with someone. And so somebody mentioned the name of someone who they think has been accumulating medication. And then I checked my records and I said, that person is in our clinic too, getting the same medication. And then we started zeroing on some of these people. And then I called some friends of mine in the Dallas Police Department, and they arranged a sting operation, and they caught these people in the schools trying to sell drugs. And the headline in the Dallas Police Department was that the clever Dallas Police Department arranged the sting operation. So good for the Dallas Police Department. They got the total credit, which we were absolutely fine with. So we could do everything kind of under the surface and give the police department the credit. You know, that's sort of an example of meeting people informally. Don't discuss business. Just know, like, trust, and then deal with business. That's the idea behind the Swedish fika. I had another client that's a private equity firm, extremely smart owner. And what he did was he has a kitchen area in the office. And he has this very long, none of these round tables. He has a very long table and people like a bench. And then he would cater really good luncheons from the local restaurants. And so nobody brought in their own lunch. Everybody wanted to have this free lunch. But the problem was you were not allowed to sit next to anybody that you worked with. You had to sit next to somebody you don't work with. And that really fostered a lot of interfunctional, interdepartmental collaboration. And it was all done through lunch. Now, the question that I think Shannon had was, how do you do it with people from other states? One of the things you could do is find some TED Talks that might be interesting for everybody. And then have everybody watch the same TED Talk at the same time. And then let's talk about the TED Talk. So instead of talking about work, you're getting to know each other through the TED Talks and getting a sense of the other person. Nice thing about TED Talks is I think they're like 14 minutes each. So they're very, very condensed. And most of the talks are quite good. But instead of talking about specific business areas, you get to learn about people from in a different way through the TED Talks. Any other questions, Maria?
Thank you.
Fantastic. Any questions or comments for Larry? Well, thank you so much, Larry. I think
My pleasure.
Oh, we have one. Go ahead,
Okay.
Shannon.
Sorry, I did have one follow-up question. I like the idea of the TED Talks and kind of that group connectivity.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about how to create kind of that environment on a one-on-one level, as Laura was saying, you know, kind of trying to create an individual connection as well when people are remote in other states and other places. It seems like it has to be so manufactured. And then, like Jackie said, there's the Zoom fatigue and all of that. Is there a way to organically create any of that common ground when you can't go for a walk in the woods together, which I love that idea, but with my folks in California, that would be hard to do.
Right. Again, my daughter works for a company and they wanted to create a bonding experience for employees that were around the country. And so they hired a chef to go to prepare some sort of dish. And everybody had to be in their kitchens watching the program and then watching each other and doing basically making the same dish at the same time in their kitchens. And that was sort of a bonding experience. I think another thing that I have recommended, there's a website called masterclass.com. And so let's say you, Shannon, and I, we find that we both like history. So what we're going to both do is see the masterclass of Doris Kearns Goodwin give a talk about presidential leadership over the years. And then we'll have a conversation about the masterclass and what we thought about it. And the idea is it's a very time-bound, focused topic that has nothing to do with business, but it allows us to really have develop a relationship. Gets us out of our functional silos. So if I'm HR, I look at things from HR. If you're manufacturing, you look at things from manufacturing. No, we're both going to we're going to both have this interaction with Doris Kearns Goodwin on Zoom and listen to her, and then we'll discuss it with each other. So like it's like a book club of steroids.
I love that idea. Thank you.
Maria, I've got one other question if we still have time.
No, we do have time.
If Larry's willing to accommodate that. So,
Sure.
So Larry, at the very beginning of the presentation, you had the slide that had the 4 different issues that we're facing, one of them being the excessive high stress that's going on.
Yep.
And I think, in part, some of that is managing home work, how it's all blending together, and people are struggling with that. This may not be related to friend, enemy, adversary per se, but given your psychology background and people, where do you think this is going in terms of the remote workforce, the stress of it versus the in-office? I mean, it seems like a pendulum swung way far to the other side, and maybe it'll balance out. But I think the psychological tolls on people is pretty strong. And I'm just curious your perspective on how do we start to balance that, and how do we start to manage that better?
Several years ago, and again, I wrote an article about this in Psychology Today. So if any of you like a copy of it, just send an email to me, lstybel, LSTYBEL at stybelpeabody.com, stybelpeabody.com.
And I will follow up with Larry and get this information and put it in our recap.
Okay, that'd be great. So I said in my presentation that viruses are not the only contagious thing around. Emotions can be contagious. So in this study, they had 3 groups. One is the control group, just do what you normally do. The second group was a diary group. You have to write down things that you appreciate. The third group was told, we want you to use the word appreciate as often as possible, whether or not you mean it or not. So I appreciate you taking out the garbage this morning. I appreciate you raking the leaves. You would use that word as often as possible. Then 2 weeks later, they looked at the 3 groups, and those people that used the word appreciate felt happier than the other 3 groups. And then they talked to the spouses of the 3 groups, and the spouse of group 3 felt more positive about the relationship after week 2 than the other 2 groups. That research kind of illustrates the idea of the contagion of emotions. Here, group 3 was told, why don't you will say that you appreciate it, even if you don't really appreciate it. But the very fact that you say it makes someone happier, and they start smiling at you, and then that comes back to you. I mean, when I go to the grocery store, I'm wearing a mask, and I'm on a line with a cashier with a mask, and I say to that person every time, I really appreciate you working here. And I can see them, through their eyes that they're smiling. And they say, glad to do it. And I know they don't mean that. They need the money. But they're saying that to me, and that makes me feel better. There's a wonderful scene in Hamlet. Hamlet accuses his mother of sleeping with the man who murdered his father. And Hamlet's mother breaks down and says, you're absolutely right. I'm nothing but a whore. What should I do? And then Hamlet says, well, tonight, why don't you pretend you're not a whore and don't sleep with him? She says, okay, I can do that. What about tomorrow? He says, pretend you're not a whore and don't sleep with him. Okay, I can do that. What about the next day? Pretend you're not a whore. and just keep pretending, and then eventually you'll become not a whore. And that's how we live most of our lives. We fake it until we become it. So what I would suggest is the best way to deal with people during this pandemic is to use the word appreciate as often as possible. And some of the things that you may not have appreciated, start appreciating. Like when somebody, I really appreciate that you showed up for work, because I know your mother lives at home with you, and that you're nervous about showing up, but I really appreciate that you're here. I mean, I'm going to give you an example.
Yeah, I think we take those things for granted.
I'm working from home. I have a garbage pickup service. Well, yesterday they were supposed to pick up the garbage and they didn't pick up the newspapers. So I called and said, you guys didn't pick up the newspapers. This morning I woke up and they picked up the newspapers at night. Under normal conditions, I might say, okay, well, they did their job. I shouldn't express appreciation for them basically doing what I'm paying for them to do. But these are not normal times. So I'm going to call up the owner of the garbage collection service and tell them how much I appreciate that they followed up and they did it.
Yeah, that's a good example. Thank you.
Yeah, so don't take things for granted, particularly small things.
I appreciate that.
People are starved for appreciation. They're
Right.
under extraordinary stress, and they don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. So until there's a light at the end of the tunnel, the best thing you can do is to appreciate what they're doing.